Barron Trump, a young man who faced public judgment simply because of how he looked, but his calm and powerful response stunned everyone. This isn't just a story about standing up for yourself, but about respect, kindness, and rising above negativity. The Grand Central Elite Terminal bustled with a quiet kind of luxury reserved for the wealthiest travelers. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling glass walls, casting warm reflections on the polished marble floors. Plush leather chairs were arranged in small clusters, where well-dressed men and women sipped coffee from delicate porcelain cups, speaking in hushed tones. In one corner, a pianist played soft classical music that blended seamlessly with the occasional sound of rolling luggage wheels. Attendants in crisp uniforms moved gracefully through the terminal, checking tickets and carrying bags for VIP guests bound for destinations like Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. At the center of it all, a sleek black sign reading "First Class and Presidential Suite Boarding" hovered over a private check-in counter where a short line of elite passengers waited. Everything about the space radiated wealth and exclusivity, creating an unspoken expectation of elegance and refinement. Yet, within this polished world, the first-class line held an unexpected figure. A young man casually dressed in jeans, a hoodie, and a bright red MAGA hat standing quietly among luxury travelers. His presence, though calm, would soon stir the air in ways that none of the suited businessmen or glamorous women could have predicted. Among the line of sharply dressed travelers, Barron Trump stood out not because of loud behavior, but because of his quiet presence and unexpected attire. At just 16, he was taller than most adults around him, his posture relaxed but self-assured. He wore simple jeans, a gray hoodie, and a bright red MAGA hat, unmistakable even from a distance. His hands rested casually in his hoodie pockets, holding a first-class ticket that marked him as belonging there, no matter what others might think. Yet, despite his calm demeanor, Mrs. Veronica Blake, a woman in her early 50s with an air of unshakable confidence, zeroed in on him almost immediately. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, pearls at her neck, and designer heels that clicked sharply against the floor, Veronica embodied the image of an elite traveler. She carried a sleek leather handbag and scrolled absent-mindedly through her phone until her eyes landed on Barron and stayed there. Her lips pursed slightly, as though already making a silent judgment. Around them, other passengers waited in line, including a young father holding his daughter's hand, looking on with casual curiosity, and two 20-something influencers half-focused on their phones but glancing up now and then. In the corner, an older couple, elegantly dressed, exchanged soft words, enjoying their morning coffee. But Veronica's gaze never wavered from Barron, her expression sharp, suspicious, and ready to challenge what she perceived as an intruder in her exclusive world. Veronica shifted her weight impatiently, her eyes flicking from her phone back to the casually dressed young man standing in line, as though he had every right to be there. The bright red MAGA hat perched on his head seemed to her like an offense in itself, a silent challenge to the refined atmosphere of the exclusive terminal. After a few more glances, and seeing that no one else appeared bothered, Veronica decided to act, her sense of entitlement burning stronger with each passing second. She stepped forward, adjusting her designer blazer, and cleared her throat with deliberate sharpness. "Excuse me, young man," she began, her voice smooth but laced with condescension. "I think you may be in the wrong line. This is for first-class passengers only." A few heads turned, curious, as the tension in her tone was hard to miss. Barron looked up slowly, his face calm but alert. He met her gaze directly, offering a polite but firm reply. "No, ma'am, I'm in the right place." He held up his first-class ticket, the words "Presidential Suite" clearly printed on it, but Veronica wasn't convinced. She gave a small, incredulous laugh, shaking her head as though amused. Surely there must be some mistake. First class is for people who... She paused, glancing him over. "Belong here?" Her voice was now louder, designed to draw in the attention of others, and she looked around as if seeking silent support. Around them, conversations quieted. A young father frowned, and one of the influencers subtly angled her phone to capture the interaction. The air had shifted, and what had begun as a private judgment was quickly turning into a public spectacle. Veronica's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know," she said louder now, her voice slicing through the quiet murmur of the terminal, "I just find it hard to believe that someone like you would have a presidential suite ticket. Those are reserved for distinguished guests, not for—" She paused again, letting her eyes linger meaningfully on Barron's hat. "Well, not for people who think a cheap hat buys them status." A ripple of whispers spread through the line as her words hung in the air, thick with judgment. Barron remained composed, though a slight crease appeared between his brows. "Ma'am, my ticket's valid," he replied, his voice calm and respectful, "and I'm here for the same reason as you, to board my train." But Veronica wasn't satisfied. She scoffed, tilting her head with an incredulous look. "Do you even know what this train is? The Presidential Express isn't some casual trip. It's for people who've earned their place here, people who have class." Her sharp words drew more attention now. A young father holding his daughter stared at her with a furrowed brow, and even the older couple in the corner had stopped their conversation, listening intently. Meanwhile, the two influencers had completely stopped pretending not to record. Their phones were now held openly in their hands, capturing every word. Barron's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level, refusing to match her rising hostility. "I'm just here to travel like everyone else. I don't think it's anyone's place to decide who belongs and who doesn't." His calmness only seemed to irritate Veronica more. "Well, someone has to speak up," she snapped, glancing around as if rallying support. "Because if we let anyone with a ticket and a—" she gestured dismissively at his hat, "walk in here like they own the place—" What's next? The quiet luxury of the terminal was now charged with tension as passengers watched closely, waiting to see how the standoff would unfold. Before the situation could spiral further, a calm but authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" asked Mr. Frederick Adams, the train manager, as he approached the first-class line. Dressed in a sharp navy uniform with a gold name tag, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to handling delicate situations. His sharp eyes took in the scene: Veronica's indignant posture, Barron's calm but firm stance, and the surrounding crowd now fully engrossed. Veronica turned toward him quickly, seizing the moment to plead her case. "Yes, there is a problem," she said, her voice still sharp but now laced with a hint of forced politeness. "I was just pointing out that this young man seems to think he belongs in the presidential suite boarding line." She shot Barron a pointed look. Mr. Adams raised an eyebrow but said nothing to Veronica. Instead, he turned to Barron and asked evenly, "May I see your ticket, sir?" Without hesitation, Barron handed it over. The manager scanned it quickly, then glanced back at his tablet for confirmation. After a pause that felt longer than it was, he looked up, his voice clear and firm. "Mr. Barron Trump, Presidential Suite. Everything is in order." A wave of murmurs swept through the line. Veronica's eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly in shock. Around them, people exchanged glances, some surprised, others nodding as if the pieces finally clicked into place. But the tension had only just begun to shift. For a moment there was a heavy silence, as though the entire terminal was holding its breath. Barron took his ticket back from Mr. Adams with a polite nod, then turned to face Veronica, who now looked as though she wanted to sink into the floor. But Barron didn't raise his voice, didn't let anger show. Instead, he spoke in a calm, steady tone that carried easily across the quieted room. "You know, ma'am," he began, meeting her eyes directly, "my father always told me that respect isn't about what you wear or what people think of you. It's about how you treat others, especially when you don't agree with them." His words were simple but carried a quiet authority that seemed to make everyone lean in a little closer. He let his gaze rest on Veronica a moment longer before continuing, "You judged me because of a hat, and because I don't look like everyone else here, but that says more about you than it does about me." His words hung in the air, sharp but not cruel. "I didn't come here to make a scene. I just want to board my train like everyone else, and honestly, I don't think it's anyone's business what kind of ticket I hold, as long as I hold it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded silently while others exchanged glances of quiet respect. Even the two influencers, still recording, had lowered their phones slightly, visibly surprised by Barron's composure. Veronica stood frozen, red-faced, unsure how to respond as Barron's quiet dignity left her without a foothold. The room, once tense, now shifted and the power of the moment belonged to Barron. As Barron's words settled into the air, a noticeable shift rippled through the terminal. Where moments ago there had been hushed whispers and awkward glances, now there was a quiet sense of reflection, an unspoken acknowledgement that something important had just taken place. The young father, still holding his daughter's hand, crouched down to her level and whispered something, likely a quiet lesson on kindness and respect. The older couple exchanged thoughtful looks, the woman murmuring, "That boy's got more grace than most adults I know." Even the two influencers, who had begun the encounter filming for entertainment, now held their phones loosely at their sides, glancing at each other with sheepish expressions, as if realizing they had caught something far more meaningful than content for clicks. Across the room, Mr. Adams, the train manager, stood silently for a moment, observing the scene, a small nod of approval barely visible on his face, and as for Veronica, she remained frozen, her arms now hanging limply at her sides, the sharp confidence she had displayed minutes earlier completely gone. Her eyes darted around the terminal, as if hoping for someone to come to her defense, but all she saw were quiet stares and a few disappointed glances. The heavy silence was finally broken when the announcement for first-class boarding echoed through the terminal, but the mood was different now. Somber, reflective, and tinged with newfound respect for the young man who had stood his ground without ever raising his voice. As the line began to move forward for boarding, Veronica remained rooted in place, her earlier bravado now completely vanished. She clutched her leather handbag tightly, her eyes downcast, clearly wrestling with her own thoughts. Finally, as Barron stepped toward the boarding gate, she took a hesitant step forward, her voice much softer than before. "Excuse me," she said, her words almost swallowed by the hum of the terminal. Barron turned to face her, his expression calm but unreadable. Veronica took a deep breath, glancing around briefly before focusing on him. "I just wanted to say, I was wrong," she admitted, her voice wavering. "I shouldn't have assumed anything about you. That wasn't fair of me." There was a pause, as if she expected him to brush her off or call her out, but instead, Barron offered her a quiet nod. "Thank you, ma'am, I appreciate that," he said, simply, his tone as steady and composed as it had been throughout. For a moment, Veronica looked as though she wanted to say more, but seemed unsure how. With a small nod, she stepped back into line, her face flushed, while Barron turned calmly and handed his ticket to the attendant, boarding with quiet dignity. As Barron disappeared down the jet bridge, the atmosphere in the terminal remained unusually subdued. Passengers stood quieter than before, many lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on what had just happened. The young father, now seated with his daughter, looked at her thoughtfully before quietly saying, "Remember, we treat everyone with kindness, no matter what." His daughter nodded, her wide eyes still watching the line. The older couple leaned close, the woman whispering, "That boy handled himself better than most adults would." A few feet away, the influencers, still holding their phones, had stopped recording and were now talking softly. One saying, "I didn't expect that, he was really composed." Even Mr. Adams, now back at his post, kept an eye on the boarding line, a faint smile of approval tugging at the corner of his lips. Meanwhile, Veronica stood silently near the back of the line, no longer seeking the attention she had courted so confidently earlier. She glanced around at the passengers, now realizing that her actions had not gone unnoticed, and not in the way she had hoped. Instead of support, she had found quiet disapproval, and a mirror reflecting her own behavior. As she finally moved to board, her expression was thoughtful, her posture less rigid. Though the terminal was returning to its usual rhythm, the lesson left behind about grace, judgment, and respect would linger long after the train had pulled away. The story teaches a powerful lesson about judgment, respect, and the importance of treating others with dignity. It reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, and making assumptions about someone's worth or place based on how they look or what they wear says more about our own character than theirs. Barron Trump, despite being judged harshly and publicly, responded with calmness, grace, and maturity, showing that true strength lies in how we handle disrespect. Rather than retaliate or escalate the situation, he chose to rise above the hostility, demonstrating that kindness and respect are always the better path. For Veronica, the encounter was humbling, revealing her own prejudices and how quickly she was willing to dismiss someone without knowing their story. Her eventual apology shows that it's never too late to acknowledge our mistakes and grow from them. The bystanders, too, walked away with a renewed understanding of why it's important to think before judging others, realizing that dignity and respect should never be reserved for only those who look the part. Ultimately, the story is a reminder that compassion and grace can defuse conflict and leave lasting impressions on everyone who witnesses them.